Good morning, everyone, and nice to sort of be here again. I hope you didn't have enough of me as yet. So it's we'll see how it goes with this session, because generally I actually first introduce this session to then move on to social reproduction. But I think there are benefits perhaps both ways to actually sort of tell the stories one way or reverse. So, and I'm saying this because I would say that when it comes to women's work, and particularly in relation to global development, the literature that I'm about to sort of talk about and the material I'm about to talk about is perhaps more known and also more used and reflected upon for policy in relation to women's paid work. So what I'll talk about today is processes of feminization of labor that are at work in global commodity chains and production network that actually connect more, I would say, with, well, first with the earlier part of my work, but also with a lot of the policy debates that with some of you we had yesterday. And I did look for pictures of strike from banana plantation workers in Ghana yesterday evening, but I couldn't find any. But I'll just I'll have to ask you for some, hopefully in the future. But certainly we will see that there is a lot to be said when it comes to sort of evidence of women organizing towards the end of the lecture, and also some reflection of which aspects or like which features this organizing take place across the world economy when it comes to women incorporated into globalized circuits of different types. Before we get there, let's have some introduction in terms of what we mean by global production networks or global commodity chains, because to an extent, I mean, there is a sense of we're rediscovering the wheel, right? When we just focus so much on processes of globalization in the last, say, half century, for the simple reason that, you know, we had production and trade to an extent always being characterized by transnational links. So, in a nutshell, if we want, the very first transnational corporations were the East India companies and the Imperial British East African Company, that in a sense actually sort of weaponized trade as part of the colonial enterprise. So we had this link for a very long time. If you even go further back to history of Indian Ocean trade, you would see how then there's an embeddedness of slavery exchanges and trade with a number of commodities that were exchanged by global merchants even back then. So the very history of textile, in fact, is very much interconnected with this colonial early roots. Yet, I think there is something that takes place in the last half century, starting from the 1970s. There is a way in which manufacturing production and processing production, when it comes to agro-food, then gets reorganized globally in ways that were not sort of seen before. And this coincides with the rise of neoliberalism that for parts of the global south has meant the move to structural adjustment programs and programs that place a lot of emphasis on the export-oriented potential of nations. So with the move from, Georgie yesterday spoke about import substituting policies and how they characterize the early development phase of a lot of countries, with the move instead from the 70s onwards towards export orientation, we have the structuring and formation of what we call global commodity chains or global value chains and global production networks. And this in a nutshell means a process of decomposition of the production process for global products. They are sold everywhere, and of course there are some products that we epitomize as global products. You know, you all having a, well, many of you are working on a Mac computer, your iPad, your iPod, well, iPods is already like dinosaur generation, my generation, you don't use that stuff any longer. But anyway, so there is like products whose production process is scattered across, and where we find even more linkages if we consider the type of inputs that we sort of utilize for you know, for the forward linkages into production. So say for your Mac, you'll have of course to focus on the linkages between US and China, China being the primary sort of exporter through a massive company called Foxconn, but then on the other hand, China itself now become a big contractor, is contracting back all this stuff, particularly to Jordan, but also to Eastern Europe in particular, where there's Chinese companies raising up. And you all know that China is entering Africa quite sort of aggressively, and for instance, not electronic but garment has definitely arrived through Chinese capital in Ethiopia. So this transformation we have during neoliberalism with the structuring of global commodity chains and networks, so manufacturing, production, processing going global this time, is accompanied by a number of transformations that involved gender in production quite strongly. So it is in fact from the 70s onwards that we have seen the increasing incorporation of women workers in labor-intensive production. As a matter of fact, at present you do see a shift even in sort of the semi-capital-intensive production. In fact, electronics is like something of the last 10 years, while textile and garment is something that started off with East Asia in the 1960s and 70s. So the question that I'd like to sort of brainstorm around today is how are women incorporated into these global commodity chains and production networks, and my field is very much the planet, so I'll just draw from examples from different parts of the world of what is meant by feminization of labor, and also how it looks and which are the issues that have been raised, and of course what are the implications for action. So how are women incorporated into these globalized circuits, and what is the relations of this process of incorporation with patterns of precarization of work? Now, before we enter the debate about export-oriented industrialization, I think it would be quite helpful to get a sense of what was there before. So between the 50s and the 70s, you have a majority of developing countries that actually adopted in the post-colonial phase import substituting policies that saw industrialization, that were characterized by specific industrialization strategies. Now, this we have learned from Georgia yesterday, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but basically during this early period, what is interesting is to reflect on women's contribution to the study of the industrial development. So if you read the first take of especially liberal feminist thinking regarding the industry in this period, was the processes of industrialization would have determined a marginalization of women, and this was based on the observation of what happened in this early development period. And this was also linked to how the industry was seen as being characterized by inflexible times, and so a number of demand and supply factors that were limiting the entry of women into the labor force. Women, of course, carried the double burden of reproductive labor. They couldn't travel for a very long distance. If you look at literacy rates during this first phase, of course, a lot of women wouldn't have the number skills to actually engage with what the industry jobs required. And based on this, the overall assessment of early feminist thinking in this period was that women would have been marginalized by the industrialization process. So the idea overall was that import substitution was a female unfriendly industrial regime, and that eventually you would have to see a decline in women workforce participation rates due to this process. Well, we know today that this is actually fantasy, because whenever we think about labor-intensive production today, we tend to think of a woman worker in a great number of sectors and in a great number of settings. So we have sort of considerable sort of evidence of feminized labor, so high level of women workforce participation rates in anything ranging from textile, garments, toy production, shoe wear, light electronics, and so on and so forth, and with pictures I just fetch here from various parts of the world, including the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and sorry, Africa is the image after. This is from Ethiopian factories, industries, which tells a little bit about what was originally the comparative advantage of women's entry into the labor force in these sectors in this period, and also in contemporary settings. That is, the comparative advantage itself banks on the historical disadvantage that women have. So the issue is not so much that, you know, women are welcome into the labor force because their disadvantage is eroded. They enter the labor force exactly because their historical disadvantage is banked upon, so that they can actually have sort of lower salaries paid, and we will see there is a construction of a discourse that will tend to regenerate them as secondary workers. Now, of course, a first sort of a snapshot of why employers will benefit from feminized employment come from wage gaps. So if you look at the, well, if you go back to 2016, I think it was last World Bank report on gender, but also if you look at the estimates we still have via the ILO or UN Women, you see there are like wage gaps all across the world. You can find it like, of course, in some places are amplified, but you will find it pretty much everywhere. You will find it, in fact, also in your own place of work. I can share what is at SOAS. At SOAS is 9% if you're a white woman and 14% if you're a black woman. So we're still not getting there. So if in places that sort of characterize upper class employment still carry the wage gap in the way they do, of course we can have a sense of what instead more sort of more labor-intensive type of employment will entail. As a matter of fact, the whole of the university sector will start this 18-day strike tomorrow, so share solidarities with my comrades back home. Now, wage gaps, however, we talk about them, we see their stickiness, but where do they come from? So I think this is where instead we need to also sort of bring in an analysis of what activists and people working in the industry, the workers themselves actually share in terms of their lived experience, and how then from this lived experience we get a sense of how the wage gap itself is constructed. And this construction of a mythology whereby the woman can be paid less is actually a very complex matter, and one that varies considerably across the world economy. So the use of stereotypical assumptions on women is what then de facto has led to the possibility to regenerate the wage gaps all along. If you read, there's a Bible on sort of women's stereotypes, that is the volume edited by Ruth Pearson and Diane Elson in 1981, that talks about the variability of these stereotypes, right? So for instance, for Asia, and this is also something this, sort of analyzed by Naila Kabir and Kim in this period, Chandra Mohanty, is the fact that you have the representation of women in labor-intensive production, particularly Asian women they wrote about, as naturally nimble-fingered, so that your dexterity comes naturally as a biological gift that then women can be put to use on the assembly line, and that's the reason why they're particularly good at certain operations that require sort of attention and sort of the use of hands for repetitive tasks. Now, this constructs a myth that everything that is skillful about a woman comes naturally to her, and because it's not acquired through training, then it doesn't have to be rewarded. So it has to be, is assumed as always being there, and that's the very basis on which you might justify women being paid less. So it's not just the wage gap that is sort of placed upon women, it's the whole construction of that gap that starts from lived experience in the factories and in the places of work that make that possible in the first place. And there's a great geographical variation of how this type of gender essentialism sort of unravel or take place. And it's always interesting. I spent all the first part of my academic career actually interviewing employers, and you really get the sense of the great variation of stereotypes that mobilize. And of course, this is based on false truths. This is false information that is shared with you that have no basis in actual reality if we accept reality as a collection of facts. But in contexts where we have a lot of imbalances in terms of power, if you look at the power that an employer might have vis-a-vis a worker, the issue of truth or untruth cannot be reduced to a statistical average, in a sense that it might be false information what I pushed on you, but because it makes your reality very real, then of course it constructs it. So an example, for instance, that I generally use is one of the first things that was shared with me when we did work on southern India, feminized textile factory, was the fact that employers were very adamant in explaining that they prefer a female workforce because everybody knows that women have to pee less than men. So, and because the women, as a biological fact, I presented that to you, have to use the toilet less than men, then of course this would mean that production on the assembly line will be disrupted less. Now, of course, there are different ways to engage with this sort of notion, right? Because, of course, this is entirely BS. This said, however, the fact that you utilize this particular sort of fact to organize your assembly line still gives very real results indeed. So the result is that women are denied toilet breaks, and in fact in the entire area you had a lot of urinary tract infections given to the fact that women were not given breaks. So in a sense it's entirely false, but at the same time it really construct the reality of intensity over the assembly line. Started off primarily on manufacturing. So if you look at the studies we have, and I myself with colleagues have contributed to this literature, is a study of how you actually use actively gender stereotypes to increase labor control in a factory. And it's interesting how this also shows how a factory is not just a space where labor anyone's labor is extracted, it's a space that actually banks on specific bodily features of the labor we carry, right? Labor power is this amazing commodity that is within each of us, and to extract it, you would see that employers actually then use very much these markers of social differentiation. So for instance, while the literature stresses a lot how the assembly line itself alienate workers or de-skills workers, right? Because rather than making an entire t-shirt, you learn only how to make collars. You learn only how to make a seam. So of course the very process in which this happens de-skills anyone. This said, it's wrong to only look at de-skilling as if it was a genderless or raceless process. Because the truth of the matter is that you also placed in particularly skilled, semi-skilled or unskilled activities based on your social profile. And we have very ample evidence of this across commodity chains. So for instance, you have Naila Kabir writing on Bangladesh that highlights how you have generally women from particular groups. They are placed in a specific part of the production process that either carry more stigma or instead they command less rewards. So there is a segmentation that takes place on the assembly line as if it was de facto a microcosm of reflecting all the inequalities that we see in society. There is other evidence by people like Martinez Novo and other feminists working on feminized production, looking at Mexico, where she highlights how you have women placed in semi-skilled activities consistently, or activities that are called semi-skilled, while the same activities performed by men are considered skilled. And you have indigenous people discriminated against from specific areas. They are placed in occupation that are considered polluting. We have similar evidence from India, where you'll have Dalit labor that is placed only in the lower echelons or asked to do tasks which are considered to be unacceptable for other castes, and so on and so forth. So you have to see the factory as a reflection of the intersectional inequalities we have in society, and at the same time regenerating these inequalities without specific action. Now, while the literature is focused massively on manufacturing, there is also a lot coming out in terms of agriculture at present in what is called the feminization of the cool chains, meaning agro-food systems, where you do see the incorporation of women as underpaid labor force at both ends of the commodity chains. So both, of course, in production, but also all the way across the filière in the consumption points, even in supermarkets and selling points that cater to middle classes, and that generally comes with combination of migratory labor force. So for instance, if I go shopping in Tesco in London, in my local area, it's very likely that I'll have a woman, and often a racialized woman or a migrant woman, that will serve me, and it's much more likely that I'll have this person rather than either a man or surely a white man. So we have the studies of feminization in agro-food is also interesting because it points at two trends. So on the one hand, it sets the continuity of commodity chains with our past. So for instance, we see a direct link with the types of colonial tropical production that characterized the colonial enterprise. So for instance, this morning I spent a lot of time to try to find pictures from banana plantation from Ghana. I didn't, and instead what I did find was a picture of a lot of protests actually treated with extreme level of violence by police in Panama and Central America and Latin America overall, where part of my family comes from, being a hotbed of industrial violence and agro-food violence of that type since time immemorial. So unionist killing in the area has always been quite dramatic, and as we speak there's just Panama workers are fighting against new forms of surveillance that are sort of put forward in the plantation. So the bananeras are fighting against the placing of cameras on the plantation to actually sort of, as in the Big Brother, start trying to sort of place surveillance on them for the entire period, not just of work, but also of life, as we discussed yesterday, right? How then the life experience and the work experience come together. Also, we have in the literature on agro-food chains a lot of reflections on the incorporation of women-headed households as small farmers into chains at highly disadvantageous condition. And I think there is now a lot of emphasis on fair trade links as a way in which this incorporation of women can instead be done in more advantageous terms. I think the issue is production gets feminized to the extent that A, the patriarchal relations manage to get reproposed and regenerated, and B, that economic rewards are up to a point. Because if you see an increase in economic rewards, generally you also see a rehearsal of processes of feminization. So for instance, a classic is also in agriculture in general. We have seen the entry of women into agriculture when you have opportunities for men, better opportunities for men elsewhere. The moment we have distress and you have higher unemployment, at least this is a quite clear trend in Asia, we're seeing defeminization of agriculture, because as returnee migrants have to do something, the men, then they'll pick up the work again, so that you just push again into, in this case, the local value chain, not the export-led one, but still the process is the same. You just sort of downgraded, if you want, to an activity which sort of reward less, commands less rewards. Also, you have this continuity with the past, in the sense of we still have tropical commodities, and in a sense we have what Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik have called the new tropical commodities, right? So the fact that in London I can buy strawberries in December for my child, that is not possible, because climatically speaking, and we try to avoid this, we try to sort of teach him that you can eat stuff based on season. But the truth of the matter is there is a conflation of season and seasonality that happens in global supermarkets, and not just in the global north, because supermarkets are coming to dominate middle class consumption across metropolis in Africa, across metropolis in Asia, definitely in Latin America, where we can access whichever food whenever we want. So of course this is an extension, a stretching of the tropical landmass in their very short book, very nice book, New Imperialism, written by the Patnaiks. And I think they have a strong point there. And beyond this, you also have the rise of new agro-food globalized systems, which are very perishable, and where you have a lot of new forms of precarious labor at work. So for instance, a classic is flower cutting, right? Flower cutting in the continent, you find it in Uganda, you find it, well, partially in Ethiopia, but I think Uganda now is picking up, and Kenya. And so this type of flower growing and flower cutting is a very sort of quickly tradable, cheap commodity that have allowed a number of countries to move into new commodity chains, but is also very fragile type of incorporation. And of course, I mean, with COVID, of course, there would be different ways along class line, along race line, along ability line, sexuality line, and so on and so forth. Sort of gender stereotype and racial stereotypes being deployed as weapons to place workers in different parts of the commodity chains. So I think this connects with some of the issues that we discussed yesterday about types of work, who does which work and how we can sort of analyze all these intersections together. There are some arguments in political economy itself that I consider to be very sort of misogynistic and very racist, and instead are very rarely called out for what they are. So a classic one is whenever you argue in favor of improvement of working conditions, the fact that, oh well, but in this area you don't find any source of other employment, right? So any job is better than no job. Well, I think this working on concepts and categories, the fundamental work of feminist political economy, because these are arguments to call out for what they are. These are really sexist and misogynistic and racist arguments. You wouldn't accept those wages being sort of imposed on core male white workers. So by the same definition, now yesterday we said we don't want to narrow the gap, we want to close it, right? So the idea is equality for all. So the point is, I think, in how to sort of make theory really alive and productive is a calling out of instead what theory has done to us for a very long time, because it's in theory that you establish then the first order disadvantage, and you can sort of create these arguments which are entirely unacceptable. Now, there is a rising literature that tries also to grapple with the placement of LGBTQ plus workers into commodity chains, and I think it's just a rising literature. The issue we're having is very few countries actually take systematic statistics on this group of extremely vulnerable people. You have now in the US, especially the work of Lead Budget, and you have actually Japan that is quite good in taking data for this group of people, but basically we have very little evidence. And I think these feminists should be very supportive of the development of data that capture this to actually sort of support then the unveiling of inequalities in the labor market that is experienced by our queer, non-binary and trans siblings, because ultimately the lack of data is what regenerated women's disadvantage itself for a long time. So it's a beautiful book by Caroline Criado Perez that is called Missing Women, that really talks about, you know, all the data we miss on women that would allow us to make a lot of arguments and to push for specific policies. And I think when it comes to queer, non-binary and trans people, we're still at the level where we really miss pretty much everything. This said, there are like some evidence that is coming out through the study of commodity chains in service, particularly call centers, where you do have that there is evidence that non-binary and trans people are incorporated. There are studies from Canada, there are studies from the Philippines, And it's interesting in the ways in which evidence suggests that there is the regeneration of the gender binary asked to be performed even by people that reject the binary in the first place as workers. So in call centers, you're asked as a trans person to have a specific type of voice or to sort of speak in a specific way. If you instead in customer service, you need to pass, so you need to be dressed a certain way. So there is a regeneration. There isn't really a challenge in the incorporation of these workers, insofar instead there is a banking on the fact of them being very marginal workers, so they can be paid even less than a woman in some cases, and in the incorporation in ways that in which they're either invisibilized, i.e. they're just only talking and they're asked to talk a specific way, or instead that they have overall to pass per the gender that is considered to be the one imposed on the shop floor. For now, we talked about what happens in factories, right? So, I mean, this is the evidence we have from factories in a number of settings, and but the process of feminization, you have to imagine it as a cascading throughout the commodity chain. So we do have a lot of disconnected to informal economy. So for instance, our comrades before talked about women fish workers in Liberia that will be part of a specific low rung of the chain in aquaculture, and we see that the informal economy itself in many cases is incorporated into global chains in ways which are quite extractive. So, and you tend to have in the when you look at data for informal employment, this is coming from the ILO, you have women are overrepresented as informal workers overall across the planet, with variation per regions, but this is pretty much what the picture looks like. And I would say that that is the case also in core nations very much. Now, this is a useful picture that I adapted and, well, first stolen and then I adapted from Marlene Carr and then from Martha Chen, where they just present us with a way to think about the informal economy, which I find useful. So the informal economy is so huge that we need to break it down and we need to class it. So it's a huge social formation which is composed of different classes. The point being is that it's bottom heavy. So the biggest classes, the more numerically big class we find, is the one at the bottom. And the one at the bottom, which the overrepresentation of workers which command poor wages. Now, you also see that this bottom heavy distribution has a very specific gender flavor to that, because it's, as you move down towards the bottom heavy part of the pyramid, where you have workers and so people that earn less, you see that it increases the overrepresentation of women. So the more undesirable the echelons of the informal economy, the more women you're likely to find, and this is generally when they are incorporated into into the global circuit. So you can find local commodity chains when you have this incorporation of home-based work of different types, or women-headed enterprises, depending on the type of commodity chain that you talk about. Now, who makes the feminized shop floor in all its chambers and different components? I think there's so many actors that actively regenerate this, and so this can be a roadmap to different policies we have to think about. So it's not just one thing that is gonna help at all. Okay, so basically you have, the first is the state, right? The state is the primary upholder of patriarchal relations, and as a matter of fact, if you look at the early period of feminization in East Asia, evidence suggests that the state not only decided which sectors women could work in, but when they exhausted the women labor force, you had a lot of other women that were literally imported from neighboring countries. So for South Korea, for instance, whenever they sort of had a labor shortage in terms of female hands in the key driving sectors during the economic boom in the 70s and 80s, they had guest schemes, guest worker schemes, where they actually actively recruited women workforce from outside, something that we find today in the Gulf with reference to the kafala system, for instance, where you have an entire regional formation that is not able to regenerate itself when it comes, for instance, well, when it comes to anything, right? 90% of labor in the Gulf is imported, but particularly for reproductive activities, you have these guest worker schemes that actually invite women over, and there is different parts of Africa whereby African states are actually very much in contact with, in fact, agencies for the Gulf. Now, so the state is definitely one of the key sources of feminization. This is not like capital in a nutshell. Capital looks for forms of cheaper labor, but then enablers are those that actually sort of put it on a silver plate, if you want. And then, of course, there are managers and employers that know all too well that by exploiting a particular labor force rather than others, they can actually decrease labor costs. There is also a sort of an uncomfortable argument to be made about the role of trade unions in regenerating women's disadvantage, because as you can see in many contexts, you'll have generally a marginalization of women in leading trade union movements that contributes to the fact that they are regenerated as a vulnerable labor force. This is definitely an issue for women, for unions in South Asia. It's definitely an issue of unions in part of Southeast Asia when we visited, and we had the majority of the leadership that was male, even if the sectors we were looking at were entirely female. And so I think there's an active need to sort of, also from the point of view of labor representation, to have a conversation in many places about the need for women leaders in the movement. So, of course, women are incorporated in disadvantageous terms, but we have seen also that since the onset of women's entry into the labor force in a number of chains and networks, we have seen also processes of construction of class consciousness and demand of rights. And we have seen in the last 2 decades a number of mobilizations that finally have women at the forefront. The garment and textile industries in many different parts of the globe have seen waves of women protests, women workers protests, leading the way, as a matter of fact, in India, where I work, in South India, in Bangalore, we have witnessed a number of strikes where women have gained significant advances when it comes to wages, social contributions, and so on and so forth. But very sort of courageous campaigns have been also fought in places like Cambodia for an increasing wages starting from 2015 onwards, and we sort of we receive reports of wage-based strikes from China. They're much sort of were not necessarily well represented in the news to the extent to which they happen, and there are people, particularly in the Hong Kong group of activist scholars, people like Punai or Jenny Chan, they're very active in trying instead to sort of share information about the protest that particularly also focus on electronics. So what we have seen is also the rise of a number of really important strikes in agro-food, although of course agro-food is a context where the level of precarity and the level of sort of marginalization is often quite extraordinary, right? So we have talked about some horrifying practices that are put forward by employers with reference to sugarcane, for instance, but we also have seen massive victories even by labor forces which are particularly marginalized. So one that I'd like to sort of always talk about is the tea workers strike and uprising starting from 2014 onwards. We had, I think, 3 that sort of well documented by Jayasilan Rai, and where women in fact have risen. These are tea plantation women workers that come from very discriminated against background. They're Dalit women, and they fought this campaign both, and I think this is crucial, both against employers as well as against unions, where the unions actually were upholding, especially in the first instance, the sort of position of the employers, because they share caste with employers and not, so they're coming from the same communities and coming from the same background. So basically there was a sort of double fight, if you want, that they waged. And I did manage to include some picture from you know, the banana strike that started in 2021 in Panama. That is the quite disquieting picture that we've seen down bottom, and that's evidence of how this is fought back by the Panama state and by the Employers Association, and this has really a very long history since colonial time into today of how trade union protests in the region are dealt with. And there is a number of protests also happening in the Philippines, which is the picture upright that is from 2018. So this is like how paid employment is progressing in a number of sectors where women working class women are incorporated in, and so that poses a number of very specific challenges for paid labor. But at the same time, we also learned of what the challenges are when it comes instead to the reproductive aspects that actually makes this possible in the first place, because that is ultimately where the disadvantage is originally manufactured and projected. And I would say that the ways in which the process of commodification of women's labor is proceeding in manufacturing as well as in food systems is in fact mirrored very much in the processes of commodification and privatization of reproductive work that you will talk about with Amrita this afternoon. So there is a continuity in the ways in which we have to think about this chain-like type of organization of laboring activities and the way in which women fit into that actually span across sectors. And that is all from me. Thanks.